Grace Morgan walked through the underground facility like a ghost present, but invisible. Necessary, but unnoticed. Her gray blouse was tucked neatly into dark slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple knot that never drew attention. The ID badge clipped to her waist reads Support Admin Ops in faded ink, the plastic worn smooth from years of contact with door frames and keypads. 10 years ago, that badge had read something very different. The morning started like any other. In the sprawling government facility, buried 3 stories beneath the Nevada desert, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across polished concrete floors and reinforced steel doors. Each door bore block lettering with sector codes and clearance levels, a maze of bureaucracy that Grace navigated with practiced ease. She carried her clipboard like armor, filled with maintenance schedules and supply requests that kept the facility running. Nobody questioned the quiet woman with the administrative duties. Nobody remembered that she'd once been the lead systems engineer who designed half the security protocols they relied on daily. The transformation had been gradual, almost surgical in its precision. First came the restructuring initiative 5 years ago, a fancy term for budget cuts wrapped in corporate speak. Her department was absorbed into a larger division. Her title shifted from systems engineering lead to administrative support specialist. Her security clearance was quietly downgraded. The new contractors had arrived with fresh ideas and modern solutions. They'd called her analog backup systems obsolete and her manual override protocols inefficient. Grace had tried to explain why redundancy mattered, why having human operable backups was crucial in a facility that controlled emergency communications for the entire Southwest region. "We appreciate your historical perspective," the facility commander, Colonel James Harrison, had told her during that final meeting, "but we're moving toward automated systems. More reliable, less prone to human error." Grace had nodded politely and said nothing about the 3 system failures she'd already identified in their new setup. She'd learned that speaking up only labeled you as resistant to change. So she'd watched from the sidelines as they installed their sleek new systems, removing most of her manual interfaces, but not all of them. Some were buried too deep, wired too intricately into the facility's foundation to extract without major reconstruction. They'd simply been forgotten, left to gather dust in maintenance crawlways that the new generation of technicians never accessed. This morning felt different, though Grace couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the younger staff clustered around their workstations, their voices carrying an edge of excitement. Or maybe it was the unusual number of officers moving through the corridors, their conversations peppered with terms like readiness assessment and full system drill. She paused near a frosted glass panel mounted beside the archive gate, reaching up to adjust the duty roster displayed inside its steel frame. The paper was slightly crooked, a small imperfection that bothered her more than it should have. "Hey, that's command personnel only." Grace turned slowly. A security officer approached, tall and impatient, his hand resting casually on his radio. She recognized him, Officer Bradley Martinez, transferred in 6 months ago from another facility. He'd never bothered to learn her name or understand her role. "I'm updating the rotation schedule," Grace explained, her voice calm and professional. Martinez stepped closer, his eyes scanning her badge with barely concealed dismissal. "Administrative staff handles logistics down in Section C. This area requires command clearance." Behind him, 2 younger technicians had stopped to watch the exchange. Grace recognized them too, Kevin Walsh and Danny Rodriguez, fresh out of training programs, full of confidence in systems they'd learned from textbooks. "Maybe she's auditing our coffee consumption," Walsh chuckled, earning a laugh from his companion. "Or conducting a clipboard inventory," Rodriguez added. "I heard. That's a specialized skill." Grace felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. She lowered her hand from the roster and stepped back from the panel. Of course, my mistake. Martinez didn't thank her or acknowledge her cooperation. He simply turned back to his post, already speaking into his earpiece about some routine security check. The technicians followed his lead, returning to their conversation about weekend plans and the latest upgrades to their workstations. As Grace walked away, she heard Rodriguez mutter something about busy work and dead weight in the system. The words followed her down the corridor like shadows. She made her way toward a less traveled side passage, one that ran parallel to the main operational areas. Here, the walls were lined with the original structural beams installed during the facility's construction. The metal was older, painted once but now dulled to a gunmetal gray that spoke of decades buried underground. Grace stopped beside one of the beams and placed her palm against its surface. The steel was cool and rough, scarred by years of service. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember when these walls were new, when she'd walked these corridors with purpose and authority, when people sought her expertise instead of tolerating her presence. A voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through her reverie. All personnel, prepare for facility-wide emergency drill commencing at 0800 hours. This is not a test scenario. All systems will be evaluated under full operational stress. Grace checked her watch. 7:45 a.m. She wasn't scheduled to participate in the drill. Administrative staff rarely were, but something about the announcement made her uneasy. The phrasing was unusual, more formal than typical training exercises. She continued down the corridor, passing workstations where technicians were powering up systems and running pre-drill diagnostics. Their movements were confident, rehearsed, backed by faith in technology that had never truly been tested under real pressure. Near the main operations center, Grace glimpsed Colonel Harrison reviewing status reports with his senior staff. His uniform was immaculate as always, his bearing commanding. He'd been fair during her transition to administrative duties, professional, respectful, but ultimately dismissive of her warnings about system vulnerabilities. The beauty of modern, integrated systems, she'd overheard him tell a visiting inspector last month, is that they're self-correcting. Human error becomes essentially impossible. Grace had wanted to remind him that human error and human intervention were two very different things. That sometimes the most sophisticated systems failed in ways their designers never anticipated. That the person who built something was often the only one who truly understood how to fix it when everything else fell apart. But she'd said nothing. Just another ghost in the machine, carrying her clipboard and her obsolete knowledge through corridors that had forgotten her contributions. The intercom crackled again. Drill commencing in 10 minutes. All stations report readiness status. Grace made her way to her small office in the administrative wing, a cramped space she shared with supply catalogs and maintenance schedules. Her desk sat in the corner, functional but forgotten, much like its occupant. She settled into her chair and opened her daily task list, though her mind kept drifting to the unusual tension she'd sensed throughout the facility. Emergency drills were routine, but this one felt different, more urgent, more real. Through her thin office walls, she could hear the steady thrum of activity building toward the 8 a.m. start time. Voices called out status updates. Keyboards clicked rapidly, and somewhere in the distance, a low mechanical hum suggested major systems were spinning up to full operational capacity. Grace opened her desk drawer, the one that always stuck slightly if you pulled too quickly, beneath a folder of logistics reports that no one had requested in months. Her fingers found something that didn't belong in an administrative assistant's workspace. A small cloth pouch about the size of her palm. She lifted it carefully, brushing away a thin layer of dust. The fabric was dark gray, its corners hand-stitched with the kind of precision that spoke of careful preservation. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, lay a narrow metal key with an unusual shape, 5 staggered grooves designed for a very specific lock. Grace had never returned this key when they'd restructured her department. No one had asked for it, and she'd never volunteered its existence. In the chaos of personnel transfers and system updates, it had been forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd originally designed the lock it opened. The intercom announced 5 minutes to drill start. Grace wrapped the key carefully and returned it to its pouch. She had a choice to make, though she suspected the choice had already been made for her years ago when they dismissed her expertise as obsolete. Sometimes the most important preparations happen in silence, by people who know that being right matters more than being recognized. The clock on her wall showed 7:58 a.m. Outside her office, the facility hummed with confident energy, trusting in systems that had never been truly tested. Grace Morgan sat quietly at her forgotten desk, holding a key to doors that everyone assumed would never need opening. She had a feeling they were about to learn the difference between efficient and effective, between modern and reliable, between what looks good on paper and what actually works when everything else fails. The drill was about to begin, but Grace suspected it wouldn't end the way anyone expected. The facility's main operations center buzzed with controlled energy as the 8 a.m. drill commenced. Rows of workstations displayed cascading data streams, their monitors painting the operators' faces in blue and green light. Grace could hear the activity from her office, sharp voices calling out system statuses, the rapid clicking of keyboards, and the steady electronic chorus of alerts and confirmations. Colonel Harrison's voice echoed through the intercom. All stations, confirm readiness. We're testing full emergency protocols today, including vault security and communication failsafes. Grace looked up from her administrative reports. Vault security hadn't been fully tested in over 3 years, not since the system upgrades had integrated everything into a single network. She'd tried to mention this during the transition planning meetings, but her input had been politely ignored. Looks like it's going to be an interesting morning, muttered Janet Reeves, the supply coordinator who worked in the adjacent office. She appeared in Grace's doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching the increased activity through the glass partition that separated administrative areas from operations. Emergency drills always are, Grace replied, though her attention was focused on the unusual urgency in the voices drifting from the command center. Janet was one of the few people who still treated Grace as more than office furniture. She'd been with the facility almost as long as Grace, though she'd managed to avoid the bureaucratic reshuffling that had demoted so many long-term employees. Remember when these drills were actually boring? Janet continued. Back when we had those clunky old systems that never broke, but took forever to do anything. Grace smiled slightly, slow and steady. Now everything's so interconnected. Faster, smarter, more efficient. Janet paused, studying Grace's expression. You don't look convinced. Before Grace could respond, a sharp alarm tone cut through. The facility's background hum. Not the usual drill signal, something harsher, more urgent. Both women turned toward the operations center, where the controlled buzz of activity had suddenly intensified. Through the glass partition, they could see technicians leaning over their workstations, their relaxed postures replaced by focused concentration. System anomaly detected in Sector 7, announced a voice over the intercom, running diagnostic protocols. Grace felt a familiar chill. Sector 7 housed the primary vault system, the secure archive that contained emergency communication codes, evacuation protocols, and backup data for every government facility within a 100-mile radius. It wasn't just important. It was critical to regional emergency response. That doesn't sound like a drill anymore, Janet observed, her voice tight with concern. Grace stood and walked to her office window, peering through the blinds toward the operations floor. She could see Colonel Harrison moving between workstations, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of tension. Senior technicians clustered around specific monitors, their conversations becoming increasingly animated. Officer Martinez appeared in the administrative area, moving quickly toward the operations center. As he passed Grace's office, she called out to him, "Excuse me, what's the status on Sector 7? Martinez barely slowed. "Nothing that concerns administrative staff," he replied curtly. "Stay in your designated areas during the drill." But Grace had caught a glimpse of his expression before he turned away. The dismissive arrogance was still there, but underneath it, she'd seen something else. Uncertainty. Maybe even the first traces of worry. Janet moved closer to Grace's window. "Look at that," she whispered, pointing toward the main display board visible through the operations center's glass walls. Where normally green status lights indicated all systems running normally, several panels now showed amber warnings. As they watched, one shifted from amber to red. "Vault environmental controls showing irregularities," announced another voice. Over the intercom. Temperature rising beyond acceptable parameters. Grace's stomach dropped. The vault's environmental system was tied directly to its security protocols. If the temperature rose too high, the entire system would engage emergency lockdown procedures to protect sensitive equipment and data. Once locked down, the vault could only be reopened through specific override protocols. Protocols that had been removed during the modernization process. Well, mostly removed. "Grace?" Janet's voice seemed to come from far away. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Grace realized she'd been gripping the window frame hard enough to leave marks in the metal. She forced herself to relax. Though her mind was racing through system diagrams and fail-safe procedures she'd memorized years ago. "I need to check something," she said, moving toward her desk drawer. "Check what?" "We're supposed to stay put during drills." Grace pulled out the cloth pouch containing the key, then reached behind her regular ID badge to retrieve something else, a second badge she'd kept hidden for years. The plastic had yellowed and the print had faded, but the text was still readable. "Systems Engineering, Vault Control Alpha, Clearance Level 9. Janet stared at the badge. "Grace, what is that?" "My old clearance." From before, they restructured everything. "But you're not supposed to have that anymore." "They never asked for it back." Grace clipped the old badge next to her current one, feeling the weight of authority she'd carried for so many years. And they never changed the locks it opens. Through the window, they could see the activity in operations becoming more frantic. Several technicians were now standing, pointing at their screens and calling out to supervisors. The calm efficiency of a routine drill had been replaced by the sharp urgency of a real crisis. "Temperature critical in Sector 7, came another announcement. "Initiating emergency cooling protocols." Grace knew those protocols would fail. The new integrated system had removed the manual override controls for the cooling system, replacing them with automated responses that worked perfectly, except when they didn't. She opened her desk drawer completely, revealing something else that didn't belong in an administrative workspace. A rolled schematic secured with an old rubber band. The paper was heavy stock, marked with red ink annotations and coffee stains that told the story of long nights spent designing systems that would outlast their creators. "Grace, what are you doing?" Janet's voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there before. "What I should have done years ago," Grace replied, unrolling the schematic across her desk. The lines and symbols were as familiar as her own handwriting pathways through the facility that bypassed the modern network. Manual controls that could function independently of the integrated systems everyone now relied on. A new alarm joined, the others echoing through the facility. This one was deeper, More ominous, the sound of critical system failure. "Vault security breach imminent," announced Colonel Harrison himself, his voice tight with controlled panic. "All personnel with vault access report to operations immediately." Grace looked at Janet, who was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "How long have you been planning this?" Janet asked quietly. "I haven't been planning anything," Grace replied, rolling up the schematic and slipping it into her satchel. "I've just been remembering." She moved toward her office door, then paused. "Janet, if anyone asks where I went, tell them I'm checking on supply deliveries in the lower sections." "Grace, wait. What if you get in trouble? What if they blame you for whatever's happening?" Grace clipped her old badge more prominently on her shirt, where it would be clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look closely enough. The faded clearance markings might be old, but they were still valid according to the facility's original security protocols. "They've been blaming me for years," she said softly, "for being too cautious, too focused on backup systems, too worried about things that would never happen. Maybe it's time they learned why I was worried." She stepped into the corridor, leaving Janet standing in the doorway with questions that Grace didn't have time to answer. The facility around her was transforming from a place of routine efficiency into something much more chaotic and desperate. But Grace had been preparing for this chaos her entire career, even when no one wanted to listen. Especially when no one wanted to listen. As she walked toward the lower maintenance sections, following paths that younger staff members had never learned, Grace could hear the sounds of a drill becoming a crisis. Behind her, the modern systems that had replaced her expertise were failing exactly as she predicted they would. Ahead of her lay corridors that time had forgotten, and locks that only she could open. The real test was just beginning. The temperature. Alarm in Sector 7 had been wailing for 12 minutes when Grace reached the lower maintenance levels. Through the facility's interconnected ventilation system, she could hear the escalating chaos above, voices sharp with frustration, equipment being moved rapidly across floors, and the electronic symphony of systems failing in cascade. She paused in a junction between the old construction and the newer additions, where a forgotten service ladder led to the vault's original access tunnels. The air here was cooler, untouched by the climate control problems plaguing the main facility. It smelled of steel and age, and the faint ozone scent that came from electrical systems under stress. Grace's radio crackled to life. She'd switched it to the emergency frequency before leaving her office. "Colonel, we've lost primary cooling." In the vault chamber came a technician's voice, tight with controlled panic. "Temperature is approaching critical threshold. Estimate 8 minutes before automatic lockdown engages." "Override the lockdown sequence," Harrison's voice crackled back. "Sir, we've tried. The system isn't accepting manual input. Digital override. Protocols are non-responsive." Grace grimaced. Of course they were non-responsive. The new system had removed manual overrides to eliminate human error and inefficiency. She'd warned them during the transition meetings that automated systems were only as good as their programming, and that programming always had blind spots. Her radio crackled again. "Has anyone located the original vault documentation? We need the legacy access protocols." "Sir, those files were archived during the modernization process. They're not in the active database." Grace reached into her satchel and touched the rolled schematic. "Not archived. Forgotten." She climbed down the service ladder, her boots finding purchase on rungs that hadn't been used in years. The lower tunnel was exactly as she remembered, narrow, lined with conduit, lit by emergency strips that cast everything in pale yellow light. She'd walked this route dozens of times during the original installation, checking connections and testing failsafes that everyone hoped would never be needed. The radio chatter continued above her. "Environmental breach in 3 minutes. After that, we lose everything in the vault chamber. Sir, what about bringing in external cooling units? Not enough time. We need that door open now. Grace moved through the tunnel, following pathways burned into her memory. Left at the power junction, straight past the communication relay housing, right at the intersection marked with faded stencil letters. Via ULT manual access, she stopped. At a sealed panel set into the tunnel wall. The access port behind it hadn't been opened in over a decade, but Grace had checked it regularly during her years as systems engineer. Just because the new management considered it obsolete didn't mean it had stopped working. Her radio erupted with new urgency. Colonel Harrison, we have a problem. The vault lockdown just engaged. Preliminary lockdown, sir. We're completely shut out. Grace felt her heart rate increase. Preliminary lockdown meant they had maybe 6 minutes before the system sealed completely. After that, even her manual override wouldn't work. The physical locks would engage too deeply for the mechanical system to overcome. What do you mean? Shut out. No digital access, no biometric readers, no administrative override. The system has defaulted to what it's calling legacy protocol only. There was a pause. Then Harrison's voice, calmer but with an edge of desperation. What the hell is legacy protocol? Grace almost smiled. Legacy protocol was what they'd renamed the manual override system when they couldn't figure out how to remove it completely. Rather than admit they didn't understand her original design, they'd simply labeled it legacy and pretended it didn't exist. She opened the access panel, revealing the mechanical interface inside. It looked like something from a much older era manual switches, physical locks, analog dials that required human judgment rather than digital precision. Everything the modern facility had been designed to eliminate. The radio crackled with increasing desperation. Sir, someone mentioned there might be a maintenance worker who knows the old systems. Grace Morgan, I think. She's an administrative now, but she used to be. Find her, now. Grace removed the key from its cloth wrapping. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in years. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd designed for, what she'd tried to prepare others for when they still cared about her opinion. She inserted the key into the first lock and felt the mechanism engage with a soft click. Above her, she could hear footsteps moving rapidly through corridors, voices calling her name. They were searching administrative areas, checking supply rooms, probably looking in all the wrong places for someone they'd trained themselves to ignore. The second lock required a specific sequence, not just the key, but a manual code entered through physical switches. Grace had memorized it years ago, practiced it regularly even after her demotion. Her fingers moved automatically through the pattern. Switches 3 and 7 up. Switch 5 down, hold for 3 seconds, then reverse. The mechanism responded with a deeper click, and she felt the first stage of the manual override engage. Her radio crackled. Emergency lockdown in 90 seconds. If we don't get that vault open, we lose communications capacity for the entire regional network. Grace began turning the manual crank that would mechanically retract the vault's primary locking bolts. It was slow work. The system had been designed to function without power, which meant everything had to be done by hand. Each turn of the crank moved the locks a fraction of an inch. But it was working. Above her, voices were getting closer. Someone had finally thought to check the maintenance levels, though they were searching in the wrong sections. They were looking for an administrative assistant who might know something about old paperwork. They weren't looking for the systems engineer who had built their last line of defense. 60 seconds to total lockdown. Grace increased her pace on the crank. The mechanism was old but reliable, designed to function even when everything else failed. Each turn brought a satisfying click as the locks retracted incrementally. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel above her position. Flashlight beams swept across the intersection she'd passed minutes earlier. "Grace Morgan, if you're down here, we need you immediately." She recognized the voice officer Martinez, the same man who dismissed her that morning as irrelevant to command operations. Now he was shouting her name through maintenance tunnels, finally understanding that the quiet administrative assistant might be more important than anyone had realized. Grace completed the final turns of the crank and felt the last lock retract completely. The manual override was now fully engaged, but she still needed to activate the release mechanism from inside the vault chamber itself. 30 seconds. She gathered her tools and began moving toward the vault's interior access tunnel, the one that led directly into the chamber that everyone else was locked out of. Her radio crackled with voices full of panic and desperation, but Grace felt oddly calm. This was exactly the scenario she designed the manual override to handle. The moment when all the sophisticated systems failed and only human knowledge and preparation could save the day. The moment everyone had assured her would never come. Grace emerged from the tunnel into the vault chamber itself, a room full of servers and communication equipment that hummed softly in the temperature-controlled environment. Red warning lights pulsed along the walls, but the equipment was still functioning, still savable. She moved to the internal control panel, a small interface hidden behind a maintenance cover that most people had never noticed. This was the final step, manually disengaging the lockdown from inside the chamber. Her radio crackled one last time. 10 seconds to permanent lockdown. "Grace Morgan, if you can hear this, we need you now." Grace reached for the final switch, the one that would override every sophisticated security protocol they'd installed to replace her obsolete systems. "I'm not obsolete," she said quietly to the empty chamber. "I'm exactly where I need to be." She flipped the switch. Throughout the facility, warning lights suddenly shifted from red to amber. The vault door's locking mechanisms began to disengage with a mechanical precision that sounded like salvation. Above her, voices shifted from panic to amazement. "The door's opening." "How is the door opening? Where's the override signal coming from?" "I'm showing manual release from inside the vault chamber." "That's impossible. Nobody's inside the vault chamber." Grace smiled as she began the process of safely shutting down the environmental emergency protocols. She keyed her radio for the first time since the crisis began. "This is Grace Morgan," she said calmly. "Vault security restored. Systems are stable. You can send your technical teams down now." The silence that followed was profound. Then Colonel Harrison's voice, tight with emotion. "Grace, where are you?" "Where I've always been, sir." "Exactly where the system needs me to be." As Grace began the process of documenting the system failure for her report, she could hear footsteps converging on the vault chamber from multiple directions. People who had spent the morning dismissing her expertise were now rushing to find her, desperate to understand how she had accomplished what their modern systems could not. But Grace wasn't in a hurry. She had work to finish, and for the first time in years, it was work that mattered. The crisis was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The vault chamber had never felt smaller than it did when Colonel Harrison arrived with half his command staff trailing behind him. Grace stood calmly beside the internal control panel, her clipboard in hand, finishing her documentation of the system failure, as if she'd just completed routine maintenance rather than saved the entire regional communication network. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in military time. "Grace," Harrison finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "How did you get in here?" She looked up from her notes, meeting his gaze directly. "Through the manual access tunnel. Same way I've been getting in here for 12 years. The manual access tunnel was sealed during the modernization." "No, sir. It was forgotten during the modernization." "There's a difference." Officer Martinez pushed forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that looked like anger mixed with embarrassment. "You're supposed to be administrative staff. You don't have clearance for vault access." Grace unclipped the faded badge from her shirt and held it up for everyone to see. "Systems Engineering, Vault Control Alpha, Clearance Level 9, Issue 12. Years ago, never revoked." She paused. "Never requested for return, either." The technical team leader, Dr. Rebecca Foster, stepped closer to examine the badge. Foster was one of the contractors who'd led the modernization effort. A woman with impressive credentials who'd arrived full of confidence in digital solutions and automated protocols. "That clearance was superseded by the new system," Foster said carefully. "The new system that just failed?" Grace asked mildly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Around the chamber, junior technicians who'd been summoned to assess the situation stood quietly, suddenly very interested in their equipment readings. Harrison moved closer to the control panel Grace had been working at. "Walk me through what happened here." Grace set down her clipboard and gestured to the various interfaces surrounding them. The integrated cooling system failed because it was designed to optimize efficiency rather than reliability. When the temperature sensors detected readings outside normal parameters, the system tried to compensate by increasing cooling capacity beyond what the hardware could sustain. "That's not supposed to be possible," Foster interrupted. "We built in multiple safeguards." "You built in digital safeguards," Grace corrected. "But you removed the physical circuit breakers that would have prevented the cascade failure." The system kept trying to fix itself until it burned out the primary cooling units. She moved to a different panel, pointing to readings that most of the gathered staff had never learned to interpret. Once cooling failed, the environmental controls triggered emergency lockdown to protect the equipment. Standard protocol accept. Your new system removed the manual override controls that would allow human intervention. Harrison studied the displays, his expression growing more troubled. "So how did you override the lockdown?" Grace walked to the maintenance cover sheet. "Removed earlier, revealing the hidden manual interface. I used the original mechanical backup system. It was installed during initial construction as a failsafe against exactly this type of scenario." "I've never seen that panel before," said Kevin Walsh, one of the technicians who'd mocked her that morning. His voice was quieter now, uncertain. "Most people haven't," Grace replied. "It was designed to be unobtrusive. The whole point was to have a backup system that couldn't be compromised by network failures or digital attacks." Dr. Foster stepped forward, examining the manual controls. With obvious confusion, "These interfaces aren't in any of the documentation we received during the transition. They weren't included in the transition documentation because the contractors assumed they were obsolete." Grace explained patiently, "But obsolete and unnecessary aren't the same thing." Janet Reeves appeared in the vault doorway, slightly out of breath from hurrying through unfamiliar corridors. "Grace, are you okay? I heard the emergency alerts and..." She stopped, taking in the scene around her. "What's happening here?" "Ms. Reeves works in supply coordination," Harrison said, as if that explained her presence. "Ms. Reeves has been with this facility for 8 years, Grace corrected. "She was here during the transition. She remembers when we had redundant systems that prioritized reliability over efficiency." Janet looked around at the assembled staff, finally understanding the gravity of what had occurred. "Grace saved the vault, didn't she?" Martinez spoke up, his tone defensive. The situation was under control. "We would have found a solution." "In 6 minutes?" Grace asked. "Because that's how long you had before the lockdown became permanent. After that, you'd have needed industrial cutting equipment and about 3 days to access this chamber." She pulled out her schematic and unrolled it on a nearby table. The paper was yellowed with age, marked with annotations in her careful handwriting. This is the original fail-safe documentation. Every bypass route, every manual override, every backup system that was built into this facility before efficiency became more important than reliability. The room fell silent as people crowded around the schematic. Even Dr. Foster leaned in, studying the hand-drawn pathways and mechanical details that weren't present in any digital database. "You kept this?" Harrison asked. "I kept everything," Grace replied, because someone needed to remember how things actually work, not just how they're supposed to work. One of the junior technicians, Danny Rodriguez, spoke up hesitantly. "Ma'am, could you show us how the manual system interfaces with the digital controls? We don't have documentation for any of this." Grace looked at him, the same young man who joked about clipboard audits that morning. His expression now showed genuine curiosity rather than dismissive humor. "The manual system doesn't interface with the digital controls," she explained. "That's the point. It's completely independent, designed to function when everything else fails." She moved around the chamber, pointing out features that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Emergency power supplies that could run independently of the main grid. Communication systems that could operate without network connectivity. Override controls that responded to human judgment rather than programmed responses. "It's like having a completely separate facility built inside this one," Walsh observed, his voice filled with newfound respect. "That's exactly what it is," Grace confirmed. "A parallel system designed by people who understood that technology fails, networks get compromised, and sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the wrong solution." Colonel Harrison had been quiet during this explanation, studying the schematic with the kind of attention he usually reserved for classified briefings. Finally, he looked up at Grace. "How long would it take to train our current staff on these backup systems?" "That depends," Grace replied, "on whether you want them to understand how to use the systems, or whether you want them to understand why the systems were designed the way they were. What's the difference?" Grace smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she'd allowed herself all day. Understanding how to use something means you can follow procedures when everything goes according to plan. Understanding why it was designed a certain way means you can adapt when everything goes wrong. She looked around at the faces surrounding. Some confused, some impressed, all of them finally paying attention to what she had to say. "I've been trying to teach people the why for 12 years, she continued. But everyone was too busy learning faster, more efficient ways to do things to listen to someone talking about slower, more reliable ways. Dr. Foster cleared her throat. "Grace, I owe you an apology. We should have consulted with you more thoroughly during the modernization process." "You should have consulted with someone," Grace agreed. "Whether it was me or not wasn't really the point. The point was understanding what you were replacing before you replaced it." Harrison rolled up the schematic carefully, treating it with the respect normally reserved for classified materials. "Grace, I'm going to need you to prepare a comprehensive briefing on all backup systems currently in place. Full documentation, training protocols, integration procedures." "Yes, sir. And I'm going to need you to lead the training program for our technical staff." Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of real responsibility. What about my administrative duties? Harrison looked around at his assembled staff, most of whom were still staring at the manual controls they'd never known existed. "I think we can find someone else to handle supply schedules," he said dryly. "Right now, I'm more concerned about finding people who understand the difference between modern and reliable." As the group began to disperse, people stopping to ask Grace questions about systems they'd never learned to appreciate, she felt Janet's hand on her shoulder. "How does it feel?" Janet asked quietly. "How does what feel?" "Being right all along." Grace considered the question as she watched Officer Martinez awkwardly attempting to understand the manual override panel, the same man who dismissed her expertise just hours earlier. "It doesn't feel like being right," she said finally. "It feels like being necessary again." 3 days after the vault crisis, Grace Morgan found herself in a position she hadn't occupied in over 5 years, sitting at the head of a conference table while other people took notes. The conference room was one of the facility's largest, with a polished table that reflected the overhead lights and chairs that had been arranged with military precision. Around the table sat Colonel Harrison, Dr. Foster, the senior technical staff, and representatives from the contracting company that had overseen the modernization project. Grace had spent the previous 72 hours preparing for this moment, not just gathering documentation and creating briefings, but mentally preparing for the conversation she'd been trying to have for years, the one about what happens when efficiency becomes more important than reliability. "Let's start with the basics," Harrison said, opening a thick folder. "Grace, walk us through exactly what failed and why." Grace stood and moved to the presentation screen, where she'd loaded a diagram showing the facility's integrated systems. The failure began with the temperature regulation protocol in Sector 7. The new system was designed to optimize cooling efficiency by adjusting output based on real-time sensor readings. She clicked to the next slide, showing a flowchart of the cooling system's decision tree. When sensors detected elevated temperatures, the system increased cooling capacity automatically, but the programming didn't account for the possibility that the increased load might exceed the hardware's operational limits. Dr. Foster leaned forward. "We tested those protocols extensively during installation." "You tested them under normal operating conditions," Grace corrected gently. "But the failure occurred during a full facility drill when all systems were running at maximum capacity simultaneously. The cooling system had to handle not just the vault's normal heat load, but also the additional heat generated by all the backup systems that were activated for the drill." She moved to the next slide, showing power consumption data from the day of the crisis. The cooling system drew 340% of normal power trying to compensate, which overloaded the primary circuits and triggered a cascade failure. One of the contract representatives, a sharp-suited man named Robert Chun, spoke up. "That level of power draw should have been impossible. We installed circuit breakers to prevent exactly that scenario." Grace nodded. "You installed digital circuit breakers that responded to software commands, but you removed the physical breakers that would have cut power automatically when consumption exceeded safe levels. The digital breakers were more precise," Chine argued. "They allowed for optimized power management. When they worked," Grace replied. "But when they failed, there was no backup protection." Harrison intervened before the discussion could become confrontational. "Grace, show us how the manual systems would have handled the same scenario." Grace clicked to a new diagram showing the original mechanical safeguards. The old system had 3 layers of protection. First, thermal sensors that physically opened circuits when temperatures exceeded safe levels, no software required. Second, mechanical pressure valves that would vent excess heat automatically. Third, manual override controls that allowed human operators to shut down systems immediately if they detected problems. She paused, looking around the table. The new system eliminated all 3 layers in favor of automated responses that were faster and more efficient under normal conditions. "But not more reliable under crisis conditions," Harrison observed. "No, sir." Dr. Foster had been taking notes throughout the presentation. "Grace, I need to ask something that might sound confrontational, but I don't mean it that way. Why didn't you fight harder to keep these backup systems during the modernization?" Grace had been expecting this question. She returned to her seat and met Foster's gaze directly. "I did fight for them. I presented 3 different proposals for maintaining manual backup systems alongside the new digital controls. I demonstrated scenarios where redundancy would be critical. I provided cost-benefit analyses showing that the backup systems would pay for themselves if they prevented even one major failure. She pulled out a folder that had been sitting beside her chair. I have copies of all my recommendations, including the responses I received. Grace opened the folder and read from the top document. Dr. Foster's response to proposal. 1. While we appreciate Ms. Morgan's historical perspective, modern systems architecture requires us to move beyond outdated approaches that prioritize redundancy over efficiency. Foster winced slightly as her own words were read back to her. Grace continued. Response to Proposal 2. The manual backup systems Ms. Morgan proposes represent a significant unnecessary expense that would duplicate capabilities already present in the integrated system. She looked up from the documents. Response to Proposal 3. We recommend that Ms. Morgan focus her expertise on administrative functions that better match her current role within the organization. The silence that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. In other words, Grace continued, I did fight for these systems, but fighting requires someone willing to listen. And everyone was too excited about the efficiency gains of the new system to worry about what might happen if it failed. Robert Chun shifted in his seat. Ms. Morgan, you're making it sound like we deliberately ignored safety concerns. I'm not making it sound like anything, Grace replied calmly. I'm stating exactly what happened. You received detailed warnings about potential failure modes, and you dismissed them because they didn't fit your efficiency model. She pulled out another document. This is from my final review before the transition was completed. I stated specifically that removing manual overrides from the vault system created a single point of failure that could compromise the entire facility's emergency response capability. Harrison took the document and read it carefully. What was the response to this warning? Grace smiled without humor. I was told that my concerns were noted and that I should focus on learning the new administrative procedures for my updated role. Around the table, people were beginning to look uncomfortable. The weight of institutional dismissal was becoming clear, along with the realization that the crisis could have been prevented if anyone had taken Grace's warnings seriously. Grace, Harrison said carefully, how many other potential failure points exist in our current system configuration? The question Grace had been hoping someone would ask for 5 years. She reached into her folder and pulled out a thick document, bound with a metal clip. I've identified 47 scenarios where the current system lacks adequate backup protection, ranging from minor inconveniences to facility-threatening crises. She slid the document across the table to Harrison. I update this assessment every 6 months, based on system changes and new vulnerabilities I observe. Dr. Foster stared at the document. You've been tracking vulnerabilities for 5 years without telling anyone. I've been trying to tell people for 5 years, Grace corrected. But when someone has been reclassified as administrative support, their technical assessments tend to be dismissed as outside their area of responsibility. Harrison opened the vulnerability assessment and scanned the first few pages. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. Some of these scenarios ... double quote, he began, then stopped. Grace, this says we could lose primary power to the entire facility if the main transformer fails during certain weather conditions. Yes, sir, the backup. Generators aren't configured to handle the load if the primary cooling systems are running simultaneously. When did you identify this vulnerability? 3 years ago. I submitted a work order for generator capacity testing. It was denied due to budget constraints. Chime leaned forward. We weren't informed of any power capacity issues during our system integration. Grace looked at him steadily. That's because by the time your integration began, I was no longer in a position where my technical assessments were considered relevant. The implications of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Years of institutional dismissal had created blind spots that threatened the facility's core mission. Harrison closed the vulnerability assessment and looked around the table. It seems we have a lot more work to do than just training people. On manual override systems, he turned back to Grace. I'm going to need you to brief our security team on every vulnerability you've identified. I want comprehensive testing protocols and remediation plans. Yes, sir. And Grace? From now on, any significant system changes get reviewed by you before implementation. I don't care if it slows down the efficiency improvements. I care about not having any more surprises. For the first time in 5 years, Grace felt like her expertise was being valued rather than tolerated. But she also knew that institutional change was harder than individual recognition. Sir, if I may suggest something? Go ahead. Rather than reviewing changes after they're planned, I'd like to be involved in the planning process from the beginning. Prevention is always more effective than remediation. Harrison nodded. Agreed. Dr. Foster, I want Grace included in all technical planning meetings going forward. Foster looked uncomfortable but nodded. Of course. Grace, I hope. You understand that our previous approach wasn't personal. Grace studied Foster's face, seeing genuine regret mixed with professional embarrassment. Dr. Foster, I understand that you believed you were improving the facility's capabilities. But good intentions don't prevent system failures. She stood, gathering her documents. If we're going to work together going forward, we need to understand something fundamental. There's a difference between being efficient and being effective. Efficient systems work faster when they work. Effective systems keep working when everything else fails. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Colonel Harrison remained behind. Grace, I owe you an apology, a significant one. She looked at him, seeing something she hadn't seen in years, genuine respect for her professional judgment. Sir, what matters now is making sure this doesn't happen again. It won't, Harrison said firmly. I can promise you that. As Grace walked back to her office, which would soon be relocated to the technical wing where it belonged, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again. But this time, it was accompanied by something she'd almost forgotten. The knowledge that people were finally ready to listen. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after the Vault crisis, Grace Morgan's new office buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Located in the heart of the technical wing, the space was 3 times larger than her old administrative cubicle and equipped with multiple monitors, engineering workstations, and wall-mounted displays showing real-time facility status. More importantly, it was occupied by people who wanted to learn rather than people who needed to be convinced. The power distribution map shows 3 critical bottlenecks. Grace explained to the assembled team of technicians and engineers. On the main display, a facility schematic glowed with color-coded power flows that revealed vulnerabilities invisible to casual observation. Danny Rodriguez, one of the technicians who'd mocked her administrative duties weeks earlier, raised his hand. Grace, this junction point here, is this why we get power fluctuations in Section 4 during full capacity drills? Grace nodded approvingly. Exactly. The load balancing algorithm assumes optimal distribution, but it doesn't account for the age disparity between different sections of the facility. The newer wings can handle surge loads that would overwhelm the older infrastructure. Kevin Walsh leaned forward, studying the display. So when the system tries to balance the load automatically, it sometimes pushes power to circuits that can't handle it, Grace finished, which causes exactly the kind of fluctuations you've noticed. She moved to a different section of the schematic. This is why I've been advocating for manual load management controls. A human operator can see the facility as an integrated system rather than a collection of efficient subsystems. Dr. Foster, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Grace, how many of these infrastructure mismatches did you identify during the original modernization planning? Grace pulled up a different document on her secondary monitor. 43 specific compatibility issues, all documented in my technical review submissions. And how many were addressed during implementation? 7. The ones that were obvious enough to cause immediate problems during initial testing. The silence that followed was becoming familiar in these technical briefings. The weight of institutional oversight was something everyone was still processing. Janet Reeves appeared in the doorway, carrying a stack of folders. Grace, I have those budget reports you requested. The ones showing maintenance costs before and after modernization. Grace gestured her in. Janet's been helping me gather historical data to support our infrastructure assessment. Janet placed the folders on the conference table and opened. The top one. The numbers are pretty striking. Maintenance costs have increased 78% since modernization, but that's not the surprising part. She pulled out a graph showing cost trends over time. The increase isn't gradual. It's concentrated in emergency repairs and crisis response. Routine maintenance has actually decreased. Colonel Harrison, who had been reviewing Grace's vulnerability assessments, looked up sharply. What is that? Tell us. Grace moved to the graph and traced the trend lines with her finger. It tells us that the new systems require less day-to-day maintenance, but when they fail catastrophically. The old systems required more frequent attention, but their failures were predictable and manageable. So we traded small, regular problems for big, expensive crises, Walsh observed. Exactly. And we lost the institutional knowledge needed to prevent those crises. Dr. Foster had been studying the maintenance data with obvious concern. Grace, these emergency repair costs, they're not just financial, are they? They represent operational downtime, mission impacts, personnel stress, ... double quotes. And they're going to get worse, Grace replied. Because the people who understood how to prevent them have been reassigned to administrative roles or retired without transferring their knowledge. She moved to her computer and pulled up a personnel database. This is our current technical staff. Average time with the facility, 3.2 years. Average time working with legacy systems, 6 months. The implications were stark. The facility was being operated by people who had never learned why the older systems existed, much less how to maintain them. Harrison closed his folder and looked around the room. Grace, what would it take to rebuild that institutional knowledge? Grace had been hoping for this question. She moved to a prepared presentation on her main monitor. 3 phases, she began. First, comprehensive documentation of all existing systems, both modern and legacy. Not just operating procedures, but design philosophy, failure modes, and integration points. She clicked to the next slide. Second, cross-training programs that teach both efficiency and reliability approaches. Our staff needs to understand when to optimize and when to prioritize stability. And third, we establish systematic review processes that evaluate new technologies not just for their capabilities, but for their failure modes and integration challenges. She paused, looking around the room. Essentially, we need to rebuild the culture that values asking, what could go wrong? As much as how can we make this better? Rodriguez spoke up. Grace, that sounds like it would slow down innovation. Grace smiled. It would slow down implementation, but it would actually accelerate real innovation by ensuring that improvements actually improve things rather than just changing them. She pulled up a case study on her monitor. Look at the vault cooling system. The new design was definitely innovative, more responsive, more energy efficient, more automated. But it wasn't an improvement because it was less reliable than what it replaced. Innovation without wisdom, Harrison observed. Innovation without institutional memory. Grace corrected. The engineers who designed the new system were brilliant, but they didn't know what problems the old system had been designed to solve, so they couldn't evaluate whether their new approach solved those same problems. Dr. Foster had been quiet during this exchange, but now she raised her hand. Grace, I need to ask something difficult. How do we know we're not making the same mistake in reverse? How do we know that prioritizing reliability won't prevent us from making necessary improvements? It was a fair question, and Grace respected Foster for asking it. We don't prioritize reliability over improvement, Grace replied. We prioritize understanding over assumption. Every improvement should make the system more reliable, not just more efficient. She moved to a new diagram showing integrated system design. The goal isn't to choose between old and new. It's to combine the best of both modern efficiency with traditional reliability. What would that look like in practice? Walsh asked. Grace clicked to a schematic she'd been working on for weeks. It looks like this. Primary systems use modern, efficient designs. Backup systems use proven, reliable approaches. And most importantly, the people operating the facility understand both approaches well enough to know when to use each one. Harrison studied the integrated design. This is essentially what you proposed during the original modernization. A version of it, yes. But this includes lessons learned from the actual system failures we've experienced. It's not just theory anymore. It's practice informed by real consequences. Around the room, people were beginning to see the bigger picture. Not just technical solutions, but a fundamental shift in how they approach the balance between innovation and reliability. How long would it take to implement this approach? Foster asked. Grace had been working on that timeline for days. Full implementation would take about 18 months. But we could start seeing improvements in system reliability within 60 days by implementing the most critical backup protocols. And the cost? Less than what we've spent on emergency repairs in the past year. Significantly less. Harrison stood, decision already made. Grace, I want a detailed implementation plan on my desk by Friday. Include resource requirements, timeline, and success metrics. Yes, sir. And I want you to present this to the regional command staff next month. They need to understand that what happened here could happen at any facility that's undergone similar modernization. Grace felt a familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility. She was about to take her local solution and propose it as a model for the entire regional network. Sir, that will require me to essentially critique the entire modernization program. Yes, it will. Do you have a problem with that? Grace looked around the room at faces that had shifted from dismissive to respectful to genuinely collaborative. No, sir. I've been preparing for that presentation for 5 years. As the meeting concluded and people filed out, Grace remained behind with Janet, who had been quietly organizing the supporting documentation. How does it feel? Janet asked, echoing her question from weeks earlier. Grace considered the question while looking at the wall of monitors showing facility systems running smoothly under her enhanced oversight protocols. It feels like work, she said finally. Important work. The kind I've been wanting to do for years. And the recognition, the apologies, the sudden respect? Grace smiled slightly. Those are nice. But what really matters is that people are finally asking the right questions. She gestured toward the displays showing power flows, system loads, and backup status indicators. For the first time in years, this facility is being operated by people who understand the difference between making things work and making them work reliably. That was always your goal, wasn't it? Grace nodded. From the very beginning. Not to be right, not to be recognized, but to build systems that keep working when everything else fails. Outside her office windows, the facility hummed with quiet efficiency. But now it was an efficiency built on understanding rather than assumption, on wisdom rather than innovation alone. Grace Morgan had spent 5 years being dismissed as obsolete. Now she was about to reshape how an entire region thought about the balance between progress and reliability. The real victory wasn't personal vindication. It was institutional transformation. The regional command center in Denver was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of mountain peaks, while the main briefing room featured a curved table that could seat 50 senior officers and civilian administrators. Advanced displays covered every wall, showing real-time data from facilities across the western United States. Grace Morgan stood at the presenter's podium, looking out at an audience that represented the decision-making authority for the entire regional network. Colonels, generals, senior engineers, contract administrators, and policy specialists, all waiting to hear why the vault crisis at her facility warranted a fundamental review of modernization protocols. She wasn't nervous. After 5 years of being ignored, she finally had an audience that needed to listen. 3 weeks ago, Grace began. Facility 7 Delta experienced a critical system failure that threatened to compromise emergency communication capabilities for the entire Southwest region. The failure occurred not because of external attack, natural disaster, or equipment age, but because our modernization efforts had eliminated the backup systems designed to prevent exactly this type of crisis. She clicked to her first slide, showing the cascade failure timeline. The crisis was resolved not through modern crisis management protocols, but through manual override systems that had been labeled obsolete and forgotten during the efficiency upgrades. Murmurs rippled through the audience. General Patricia Brooks, the regional commander, leaned forward. "Ms. Morgan, are you suggesting that our modernization program created vulnerabilities rather than eliminating them?" "I'm stating that our modernization program traded predictable, manageable problems for unpredictable, catastrophic ones," Grace replied. "And I can prove it." She moved to the next slide, showing failure rates across all regional facilities before and after modernization. Routine maintenance issues decreased 43% following system upgrades, but crisis-level failures requiring emergency response increased 89%. The numbers were stark, undeniable. Grace had spent weeks gathering data from every facility in the region, building a case that couldn't be dismissed as the complaint of a single disgruntled employee. "More concerning is the trend," she continued, clicking to a projection chart. "Crisis frequency is accelerating as integrated systems age and as institutional knowledge of backup procedures continues to erode." Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief technology officer for the regional command, spoke up. "Ms. Morgan, these statistics could be explained by the natural aging of infrastructure. Correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation." Grace had expected this challenge. "You're absolutely right, Dr. Webb, which is why I've also analyzed similar facilities that maintain hybrid approaches combining modern efficiency with traditional reliability protocols." The next slide showed comparative data from facilities that had resisted full modernization. Facilities that retained manual backup systems show 23% fewer crisis-level failures and 67% faster recovery times when failures do occur. She paused, letting the implications settle. The difference isn't in the quality of the modern systems. It's in what happens when those systems fail. General Brooks studied the comparative data. "You're arguing for a fundamental change in our approach to technology integration." "I'm arguing for a more complete approach," Grace corrected. "One that asks not just, how can we make this more efficient, but also, what happens when this fails, and how do we ensure that failure doesn't become catastrophic?" She moved to a detailed case study of the vault crisis. At Facility 7 Delta, The cooling system failure would have been a minor inconvenience under the old hybrid approach. A technician would have noticed the temperature rise, manually adjusted the cooling output, and filed a maintenance request. Total downtime, maybe 30 minutes. Instead, the fully automated system tried to self-correct until it caused a cascade. Failure that took the entire vault offline and threatened regional communication capabilities. Recovery required manual intervention using systems that weren't even documented in our current operational procedures. Colonel Harrison, who had flown in to support Grace's presentation, stood up. "General Brooks, I was there during the crisis. Without Grace's knowledge of the legacy backup systems, we would have lost all vault access for a minimum of 3 days, possibly longer. And how many people at your facility understand these backup systems?" Brooks asked. "Before the crisis." "One person," Harrison replied. "Now we're training our entire technical staff, but it's taken weeks to rebuild knowledge that should never have been discarded." Grace moved to her core recommendation slide. "I'm proposing a hybrid systems approach that maintains modern efficiency while preserving critical backup capabilities. This isn't about choosing between old and new. It's about ensuring that new systems improve reliability rather than just replacing it." Dr. Webb leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Morgan, what you're describing would significantly increase implementation costs and complexity. What I'm describing would significantly decrease crisis management costs and operational risks," Grace replied. "The question is whether we want to pay for prevention or keep paying for emergencies." She clicked to a cost analysis that showed the financial impact of her proposed approach. Initial implementation costs would be approximately 15% higher than full modernization, but reduced emergency response costs would offset that investment within 18 months. And the long-term benefits? Long-term, we'd have facilities that become more reliable over time rather than more vulnerable. We'd retain institutional knowledge instead of losing it. And we'd be prepared for failure modes that we haven't even anticipated yet. General Brooks had been taking notes throughout the presentation. "Ms. Morgan, this is essentially a critique of our entire regional modernization strategy." "Yes, ma'am, it is." The directness of Grace's response surprised several people in the audience. She wasn't hedging or softening her criticism. She was stating her professional assessment clearly and letting the consequences follow. "What qualifies you to make such a comprehensive critique?" asked Dr. Webb, his tone carrying a slight edge. Grace had been preparing for this question for weeks. "I designed the original backup systems at Facility 7 Delta. I documented vulnerabilities during the modernization process that were ignored. I maintained those systems after they were officially abandoned. And when every modern protocol failed, I was the only person who could restore critical operations." She paused, meeting Webb's gaze directly. "More importantly, I'm not alone. Every facility in this region has experienced people who understand both traditional and modern approaches. But most of them have been reassigned to administrative roles or have left government service entirely." "Are you suggesting we've systematically discarded valuable expertise?" "I'm stating that we've systematically discarded valuable expertise. The question is whether we want to continue that pattern or learn from it." General Brooks stood, signaling the formal end of the presentation. "Ms. Morgan, this has been illuminating. I'm going to need time to review your recommendations with my staff." "Of course, ma'am. In the meantime, I want you to prepare a detailed implementation guide. If we decide to move forward with this hybrid approach, we'll need specific protocols for every facility in the region." Grace felt the weight of institutional responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have that ready within 2 weeks." As the audience began to disperse, several people approached Grace with questions and comments. Some were skeptical, others curious. But all of them were engaged with her ideas in a way that hadn't happened in years. Dr. Webb approached last, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Morgan, I owe you an apology. Not for questioning your recommendations. That's my job. But for the assumptions I made about your qualifications based on your current job title." Grace appreciated the honesty. "Dr. Webb, the job title was never the problem. The problem was that we stopped listening to people based on their titles rather than their knowledge." He nodded slowly. "If General Brooks approves your hybrid approach, would you be willing to lead the regional implementation team?" The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I'd be honored to contribute to regional implementation, but I want to make sure we're building teams that include both modern innovators and traditional reliability experts." Agreed. "The goal is institutional learning, not institutional revenge." As Grace packed her presentation materials, Colonel Harrison approached. "How does it feel to finally get the audience you deserved 5 years ago?" Grace looked around the briefing room, still buzzing with conversations about reliability, backup systems, and the balance between efficiency and resilience. "It feels like the beginning of the real work," she said. "Convincing people to listen was just the first step. Now we have to prove that the hybrid approach actually works better than what we've been doing." "Any doubts?" Grace smiled. "None. I've been testing these ideas for 5 years. I know they work." "Even on a regional scale?" "Especially on a regional scale. The bigger the system, the more important it is to have backup plans that don't depend on everything else working perfectly." As they left the briefing room, Grace felt a sense of completion that had been missing for years. Not the completion of victory, but the completion of being heard, of having her expertise valued and her warnings taken seriously. The institutional transformation she'd been working toward was finally beginning. But she also knew that real change would be measured, not in presentations or policy approvals, but in whether facilities across the region would be more reliable, more resilient, and better prepared for the inevitable moment when perfect efficiency wasn't enough. The work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, it was work that matched the scope of the problems she'd been trying to solve. 6 months after her presentation to Regional Command, Grace Morgan stood in the control room of Facility 12 Echo, watching a new generation of technicians conduct their first emergency drill using hybrid protocols. The facility, located outside Phoenix, was serving as the pilot site for the integrated approach she'd developed. Unlike the sterile efficiency of purely modern control rooms, this space hummed with purposeful redundancy. Digital displays showed real-time system status alongside analog gauges that could function independently of network connectivity. Manual override panels were prominently positioned and clearly labeled, not hidden away as afterthoughts. "Temperature spike in Sector 4, announced technical specialist Lisa Chun, her voice calm and professional. "Digital cooling system responding." Grace watched approvingly as Chun followed the new hybrid protocols. Instead of simply trusting the automated response, Chun also checked the manual temperature gauges and confirmed that the digital system's readings matched physical reality. "Manual gauges confirm temperature elevation," Chun continued. "Digital cooling response appears effective. Monitoring manually for 30 seconds to verify stability." Beside Grace, Colonel David Martinez, transferred from another facility to oversee the pilot program, nodded with satisfaction. 6 months ago, our technicians would have trusted the digital reading and moved on to other tasks. And if the digital system had been providing false readings? Grace asked. "We would have discovered the problem when equipment started failing." Grace gestured toward Chen, who was now manually adjusting cooling flow to provide an additional safety margin beyond what the automated system had calculated. "Now our people understand both approaches. They trust the digital systems but verify with analog backups. They use automated efficiency, but maintain manual oversight. The difference was profound. Instead of operators who simply monitored automated systems, the facility was staffed by technicians who understood how to actively manage complex interdependent systems. "Emergency power simulation initiating," announced another technician. Throughout the facility, primary power was cut to test backup generation and load management capabilities. Grace watched as the response unfolded. Digital systems switched seamlessly to backup power, but technicians also manually verified that critical systems were properly prioritized and that power distribution matched planned protocols. "This is what I've been trying to build for 7 years," Grace said quietly. "Operators who understand their systems well enough to manage them intelligently, not just monitor them passively." The drill continued for another hour, testing scenarios that range from routine maintenance issues to catastrophic failure simulations. In every case, the hybrid approach proved more resilient than either purely digital or purely analog systems would have been. When the exercise concluded, Grace addressed the assembled technical staff. These were mostly young engineers and technicians, but they'd been trained from the beginning to think in terms of both efficiency and reliability. "What did you learn today?" she asked. Chun raised her hand. The automated systems handled routine problems perfectly, but human oversight caught 2 scenarios where the automated responses would have been inadequate. "What kind of scenarios?" The power distribution simulation allocated backup power based on standard load calculations, but it didn't account for the fact that the heating system was already running at elevated capacity due to outside temperature. Manual oversight allowed us to preemptively adjust power allocation before the automated system would have recognized the problem. Grace smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that prevents small problems from becoming major crises." Another technician, Marcus Rodriguez, spoke up. "The manual systems felt slower at first, but they gave us more confidence in our decisions. When you can physically verify what the computers are telling you, you trust the overall system more. And that trust translates into better performance under pressure," Grace replied. "When you understand how your tools work, you can adapt them to situations their designers never anticipated." After the debrief, Grace walked through the facility, with Colonel Martinez reviewing the changes that had been implemented over the past 6 months. The physical infrastructure looked similar to other modern facilities, but the operational culture was fundamentally different. "The regional command is watching this pilot program very closely," Martinez told her. "If the reliability metrics continue to improve, they're prepared to implement hybrid protocols across all facilities in the Western region." Grace paused beside a manual override panel that gleamed with recent use rather than gathering dust like a forgotten relic. "The metrics are already compelling, but the real test will be how these systems perform during actual crises, not just simulated ones. Any concerns about that?" "None. This approach isn't theoretical anymore. It's been tested under real pressure. The question isn't whether it works, but whether we can scale it effectively." They continued through the facility, passing workstations where technicians seamlessly integrated digital efficiency with analog reliability. The hybrid approach had become natural, intuitive, a normal part of how business was conducted rather than an awkward compromise between competing philosophies. "Grace, I have some news," Martinez said as they reached his office. "General Brooks wants you to brief the Joint Chiefs on expanding the hybrid approach beyond regional facilities." Grace felt a familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility. National implementation? Potentially. The cost savings from reduced emergency responses have gotten attention at the highest levels. But more importantly, the reliability improvements have convinced people that this isn't just about fixing problems. It's about preventing them. She considered the implications. A national rollout would mean coordinating with dozens of facilities, hundreds of contractors, and thousands of personnel, who would need to fundamentally change how they thought about the relationship between efficiency and reliability. "That's a significant undertaking," she said finally. "It is. But you've already proven the concept works. Now it's just a matter of scale." Grace looked out Martinez's window at the Arizona desert, stretching toward the horizon. 6 months ago, she'd been a forgotten administrative assistant whose warnings were dismissed as obsolete thinking. Now she was being asked to reshape how the entire national infrastructure approached technology integration. "Colonel, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think this would have happened if the Volt crisis hadn't forced everyone to pay attention?" Martinez considered the question carefully. "Honestly, probably not. Sometimes it takes a near disaster to make people receptive to solutions they should have implemented years earlier. So, the crisis was necessary. The crisis was inevitable." He corrected. What was necessary was having someone who understood how to solve it and was willing to keep advocating for better approaches, even when no one wanted to listen. Grace nodded, appreciating the distinction. She hadn't caused the crisis, but she'd been prepared for it. And that preparation had come from years of quiet persistence in the face of institutional indifference. As she prepared to leave the facility, Grace stopped by the control room one more time. The evening shift was taking over, and she watched as the day crew briefed their replacements on system status, ongoing maintenance, and operational notes. But unlike the cursory handoffs she'd observed at other facilities, this briefing included detailed discussion of manual backup status, analog verification procedures, and contingency plans for various failure scenarios. The technicians weren't just reporting that systems were running. They were demonstrating that they understood how and why they were running. "Ma'am?" Lisa Chun approached as Grace prepared to leave. "I wanted to thank you for something." Grace paused, curious. "What's that?" "For teaching us that being thorough isn't the same as being slow, and that being efficient isn't the same as being reckless." Chun gestured toward the hybrid control panels. "Before this training, I thought technology was about choosing between old and new. Now I understand it's about choosing what works best for each situation. That's exactly the lesson I was hoping you'd learn. It's made me a better technician, but it's also made me more confident. When you understand your systems completely, you're not afraid of them failing because you know how to fix them." Grace smiled, recognizing in Chun the kind of thinking she'd been trying to cultivate for years. That confidence is what makes the difference between managing a crisis and being overwhelmed by one. As Grace walked to her car, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred, not just in the facilities she'd worked with, but in the broader institutional approach to reliability and innovation. The change hadn't come from policy directives or budget allocations, but from proving that there was a better way to think about technology and human capability. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Janet Reeves. "Saw the news about the national briefing. Proud of you. Coffee when you get back?" Grace smiled as she typed her response. "Absolutely. And Janet, thank you for believing in this before anyone else did." The drive back to Facility 7 Delta gave Grace time to think about what came next. The national briefing would be the biggest professional challenge of her career, but it was also an opportunity to ensure that other facilities wouldn't have to learn these lessons through crisis. As she pulled into the parking lot of her home facility, Grace noticed something that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Through the windows of the control room, she could see technicians actively monitoring both digital displays and analog backup instruments. The hybrid approach had become so integrated into daily operations that it no longer looked like a compromise. Between competing systems, it looked like the natural way to run a complex facility. Inside the building, she found Colonel Harrison reviewing overnight reports in his office. He looked up as she knocked on his doorframe. How did the Phoenix evaluation go? Better than expected, Grace replied. The hybrid protocols are working exactly as designed. More importantly, the technicians are thinking like engineers rather than just operators. Harrison gestured for her to sit down. Grace, I've been thinking about something. 6 months ago, you saved this facility with knowledge that you preserved despite years of institutional indifference. What does that teach us about how we treat expertise in general? It was a thoughtful question, one that went beyond technical systems to organizational culture. I think it teaches us that dismissing experience as obsolete is different from understanding when experience needs to be updated, Grace replied. The goal should be evolution, not replacement. How do we ensure we don't make the same mistake again? How do we avoid discarding valuable knowledge just because it's not immediately obvious why it's valuable? Grace considered the question carefully. I think we need to change how we evaluate proposals and expertise. Instead of asking, what can this new approach do? We also need to ask, what problems was the old approach designed to solve? And does the new approach solve those same problems? Institutional memory as a form of due diligence. Exactly. Innovation should build on understanding, not replace it. Harrison nodded slowly. That's going to be an important principle as we implement hybrid approaches nationally. We need to make sure we're learning from this experience rather than just replicating it. As Grace prepared to leave for the day, she walked through the facility one more time, observing the quiet competence of the evening shift. The changes she'd implemented weren't dramatic or visible to casual observation, but they represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about their relationship with technology. Instead of trusting systems blindly, technicians now verified actively. Instead of assuming efficiency meant reliability, operators now understood that the two goals required different approaches. Instead of treating backup systems as unnecessary redundancy, staff now maintained them as essential insurance against the inevitable failure of primary systems. Grace's office had been relocated again, this time to a larger space adjacent to the main technical areas, with windows that looked out over the facility's core operational zones. Her desk still carried the same clipboard she'd used as an administrative assistant, but now it was surrounded by engineering workstations, system schematics, and communication equipment that connected her to facilities across the region. On her bulletin board, alongside current project timelines and technical specifications, she'd pinned a small photograph from the vault crisis 6 months earlier. It showed her standing beside the manual override panel, key in hand, with the expression of someone who was exactly where she needed to be. But next to that photograph was another image, one taken the previous week, showing Lisa Chun and Marcus Rodriguez training a group of new technicians on hybrid protocols. The photograph captured the moment when institutional knowledge was being actively preserved and transmitted rather than discarded and forgotten. That second photograph represented something more important than personal vindication. It showed the beginning of a culture that valued both innovation and wisdom, that understood the difference between what was new and what was better. Grace turned off her office lights and headed home, carrying with her the satisfaction of work that mattered and the anticipation of challenges that would test everything she'd learned about building systems that keep working when everything else fails. In 2 weeks, she would stand before the Joint Chiefs and propose transforming how the entire national infrastructure approached the balance between efficiency and reliability. The presentation would draw on everything she'd learned from years of being ignored, months of being heard, and weeks of proving that there was a better way to think about technology and human capability. But tonight, she was simply an engineer who had spent her career understanding that the most important systems are the ones you hope you'll never need. And the most valuable knowledge is often the kind that people don't appreciate until everything else stops working. Grace Morgan had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But she had never stopped believing that quiet competence and careful preparation were more powerful than recognition or authority. The vault crisis had proved her right, but more importantly, it had created the opportunity to build something better: systems that combine the best of human judgment with the efficiency of modern technology. Institutions that preserved wisdom while embracing innovation, and a culture that understood that true expertise isn't about knowing all the answers, but about asking the right questions before they become critical. As Grace drove home through the Nevada desert, she could see the lights of other facilities scattered across the landscape, installations that would soon be operating under protocols she'd developed, staffed by people trained in approaches she'd advocated, protected by backup systems she'd designed years earlier when no one thought they'd ever be needed. The real victory wasn't personal recognition. It was the knowledge that when the next crisis came, and there would always be a next crisis, people would be ready not just to respond, but to prevent small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. Sometimes, the most important contributions are made by people who understand that being right matters more than being noticed, and that the best time to prepare for an emergency is long before anyone believes the emergency will happen. Grace Morgan had spent years being the quiet expert in the corner, maintaining systems that everyone hoped would never be needed. When those systems became the only thing standing between routine problems and regional catastrophe, she was ready. And now, thanks to her persistence and preparation, an entire generation of technicians would be ready too. The story of the forgotten engineer who saved the vault had become the foundation for a new approach to reliability, resilience, and the kind of quiet competence that keeps the world running even when no one notices. In the end, Grace Morgan's story reminds us that the most valuable expertise often comes from people who understand not just how things work, but why they were designed to work that way. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who has been preparing for the moment when everything else fails. True authority comes not from titles or recognition, but from knowledge, preparation, and the quiet confidence to act when action is needed most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.